So our role, of course, at the TGA is not just in the regulatory approval of vaccines, what we call pre-market, but to, for months and years after any medicine or vaccine is approved, to continue to monitor its safety. We also have the advantage, and often bags under our eyes, because we have the advantage of very close networks internationally. So, for example, I was involved, together with a couple of colleagues, in a video conference with no fewer than 18 countries last night until about midnight, talking about the safety reports for both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and also Moderna, which isn't relevant to Australia. There's really two things that our safety detectives have to do with reports to vaccines. So the first is, for example, with the recent clotting events that have been described, is trying to unpick the difference between background rates in the community. So we know that sadly people get sick every day, and in Australia the statistic is 165,000 people die every year. It'd be a crowded planet if people didn't die, as sad as it is from a personal point of view. We also know that even with things like clots, 17,000 a year either present at hospitals, sometimes as emergencies, but also in a routine course of care with your doctor, and they're generally treated with anticoagulant medicines. So our challenge is knowing that if 17,000 people get clots a year, and even an unusual sort of clotting that's been detected, and only detected in 2 or maybe a third European countries, even if that's, say, 200 or 300 a year, differentiating between what is just frankly bad luck, natural frequency of these things happening, and whether it's a cause and effect with a vaccine. And as I've said, or as Professor Murphy said, a number of European countries, but not the overarching agency, they are still firm with us in that they don't believe there's cause and effect, but there's an extensive meeting tonight, Australian time, involving all the European experts, in addition to the studies and discussions that we've already had with them. So we're obviously waiting to see if there's any further information, but at this stage we don't believe that there's conclusive evidence of cause and effect with the clotting issue. We also have said, and I've said in the media several times in the last 24 hours, that the largest group of people vaccinated with the same vaccine in the UK, almost 11 million, in fact it's heading towards 12 now, have not shown this clotting problem. And also in totally different systems, the Saudi Arabian system, just to pull one out of the air, they've vaccinated 1 million people with the AstraZeneca vaccine and not seen this clotting problem. So it's been reported in a couple of comparatively small countries, such as the Netherlands and Norway possibly, they're still not sure, and Germany has also identified a few possible reports. But again, we're busily working with our European and international colleagues to identify whether it's cause and effect. We don't believe it is at the moment, but as we have more information, we regularly put up updates. Today I want to talk about something that, as Professor Murphy mentions, does happen in a small number of individuals called anaphylaxis. It's an allergic reaction. And yes, a lot more of us are allergic to things like house dust and dogs. I'm allergic to rabbits, for example, which is a result of 20 years of working as an immunologist in a lab. And guess what? I was vaccinating rabbits and eventually become allergic to them. So allergy to animals and things are quite common. Less common, though, is allergy to specific drugs or vaccines, but it's not unknown. And from the very first days of the Pfizer rollout, there was a small number of people who showed these anaphylactic reactions. Now, as Brendan mentioned, the clinics are set up with adrenaline, and generally most well-trained doctors and clinics know exactly what to do. There's also a case of some of these may not be true anaphylaxis, but just be a less severe form of allergic reaction. So, but the main message I want to take out is this is not something about COVID vaccines. Any medicine or vaccine in a very small number of people can cause this anaphylactic reaction. We've probably all heard about kids who can't eat peanuts. That's an example. That's more common than medicine anaphylaxis. And the guidance, as it says, is that if you're one of these people who has a known history of reaction to drugs or vaccines, talk about it with your vaccinator, give them a heads up, and stay under monitoring for 30 minutes after the vaccination. That's not a blanket recommendation. Everyone else, there's a recommendation from ATAGI, which is the clinical advisory group, that you stay for 15 minutes and be monitored post-vaccination. So what are we doing about these anaphylaxis reports, and what do we know? So we have 19 reports of anaphylaxis nationally, mainly actually from the Pfizer vaccine. And that's consistent with the global experience, but while this is rare, it is less rare for the Pfizer vaccine and for the AstraZeneca vaccine. But it also happens rarely with all sorts of other vaccines. That's what this has nothing to do with COVID vaccines specifically. We've had 14 of those following the Pfizer in Australia and 5 following the AstraZeneca vaccine. So there appears to have been a cluster in Queensland, and again, clusters happen, and it's not necessarily something special about Queensland. Now, we've looked at that batch of vaccine. That batch of vaccine that's being used in Queensland has actually been administered right across the country, and yet we've only had one other possible case of anaphylaxis elsewhere in the country. And that batch has been administered, and I wouldn't be surprised, my 2 colleagues here, I haven't had the vaccine yet, I'm waiting my turn and I'll do the eligibility checker, but I wouldn't be surprised the same batch has been used in my 2 colleagues here. The other thing that we've done, just to check there's nothing wrong with that particular batch, is we have done extensive laboratory testing. We have well-equipped laboratories that you may have seen the Minister and Prime Minister visit. And they've actually physically tested samples of that batch, and in parallel, the exact same batch has been tested by the UK equivalent of TGA, and they have one of the best laboratories and a much bigger lab than we have for testing the same batch, and there were no problems with it. So we believe it's safe to use. We are continuing to look at the individual cases of anaphylaxis, trying to pin down whether it's related to the vaccine, whether there's something particular about the way the vaccine was administered, and, for example, whether that should add to any other warnings or safeguards. But we certainly don't believe that there's a problem with that particular batch, and we certainly don't believe there's any specific problem around either AstraZeneca or Pfizer COVID vaccines. These are rare events that do happen in patients. And the other thing is that individuals who have had vaccine or drug anaphylaxis generally, as Professor Murphy said, know about it. They know that we've got to be careful, and so that's why we're encouraging people who have had anaphylaxis to a medicine or a vaccine to have that discussion before they're vaccinated. But we're very confident about that individual vaccine. But our advice, just to conclude, which is consistent with the TARGI, is that it should be administered as per the advice. So if you are an anaphylactic person, you watch for 30 minutes and you tell the vaccinator ahead of time. But there shouldn't be general concern among the overwhelming majority of us who do not have these allergic reactions. There should be no concern.